My grandfather paid his electric bill every month for 51 years without missing a single payment. First one came in October of 1951. Last one came in March of 2002, 3 weeks before he died. I found the whole stack of them in a shoebox in his closet when we were cleaning out the house. 51 years of envelopes, each one opened with the same letter opener he kept on his desk, each one paid within 3 days of arrival. Never late, never questioned. Just paid the way you pay for air, because what else are you going to do? I sat on the floor of that closet with those umphs in my lap, and I did the math on the back of one of them. 51 years of payments. Adjusting roughly for the rate increases, I could track across the decades from the amounts written on the stubs he had kept inside each envelope, because my grandfather kept everything. The total came to just over $47,000. $47,000 paid to a single company over 51 years for the privilege of having electricity come through a wire in a wall. He never questioned it. Not once that I can find in anything he wrote or anything my mother remembers him saying. It simply was what it was. The electric bill came. You paid it. That was the deal. I put those envelopes back in the shoebox and I sat there for a while thinking about what $47,000 represents in the life of a working man. What it could have been, what it was instead. And I thought about what my grandfather would have said if I had sat down next to him sometime around 1955 and showed him a steel box the size of a lunch pail that could power his house lights for a century without a single payment to anyone. I think he would have looked at it for a long time without saying anything. And then I think he would have asked why nobody told him about it. That is the question I have been trying to answer for 3 years. And what I found is that somebody did know about it. Thomas Edison knew about it. He filed the patent in 1901. He spent 10 years trying to get it into production at scale. And then a set of decisions made in boardrooms in Detroit and Dayton between 1912 and 1920 buried it so completely that by the time my grandfather was opening his first electric bill in 1951, almost nobody in America remembered it had ever existed. Almost nobody, the Amish, remembered. And in a barn outside Lancaster County, Pennsylvania, on a shelf that gets no more ceremony than the shelf next to it holding paint cans and rope, there is a row of those steel boxes that have been running the lights in that barn since 1948. Same batteries, no service call, no bill. I want to take you back to New York City in the year 1900 because the world you find there is not the world most people picture when they think about 1900. The streets are loud. They always are. But the sound is different from what you expect. Yes, there are horses. Yes, there is the clatter of iron wheels on stone. But threading through all of that, quieter than you would think, are electric automobiles. Not a few of them, not curiosities. By the year 1900, electric cars outnumbered gasoline cars on American roads. That is a documented fact, not a footnote or a trivia question. Electric cars outnumbered gasoline cars in 1900. The problem was the battery, always the battery. The technology they were running on was lead acid, the same basic chemistry that sits under the hood of your truck right now, a chemistry that had already been understood for 40 years by 1900, and that had the same fundamental flaw in 1900 that it has today. It was heavy, it corroded, it degraded, it gave you maybe 2 years of reliable service, and then it became a problem. It could not get you more than 30 miles before it left you on the side of the road, wondering if the future was going to work out. Edison saw this. Edison had already made his money and built his reputation. He had the phonograph, the light bulb, the motion picture camera, the phonograph record, the electrical distribution system. He was the most famous inventor in the world, and he had enough credibility and enough capital to turn his attention to anything he chose. What he chose in the spring of 1898 was the battery problem. He wrote in his private notebooks, which are preserved today at Rutgers University in the Edison Papers archive, that he considered it the most obstinate problem he had ever attempted. He meant that as a challenge, not a complaint. He tested over 10,000 combinations of metals and electrolytes in his laboratory in West Orange, New Jersey. 10,000. His notebooks from this period, which I have read on microfilm in a library in Newark on 2 separate trips, because I wanted to see them in his own handwriting, show page after page of failures recorded with the flat patience of a man who understood that failure was just information. Then in 1901 he found it: nickel, iron, potassium hydroxide. An iron plate and a nickel oxide plate dropped into a solution of potassium hydroxide, which is lye, the same substance your great-grandmother used to make soap. When you charge it, electrons move one direction. When you discharge it, they move back. The plates do not corrode each other. Nothing crystallizes permanently. Nothing eats itself alive the way lead and sulfuric acid eat each other every day in the battery in your vehicle. Edison claimed it would last the lifetime of whatever vehicle it powered. He was not exaggerating. He was, if anything, underselling it. The units he sold to the railroads for signal lighting in the first decade of the 1900s, many of them are still working. Not a figure of speech, not an approximation. The Magnet Academy at the National High Magnetic Field Laboratory has documented original Edison cells from 1903 that still hold a charge 122 years after they were manufactured. The railroad signal station in Montana that a colleague of mine visited in 2019 had cells in it dated to 1946. They pulled one off the shelf, flushed it with fresh potassium hydroxide solution, and it came back to 82% of its original rated capacity. 82% after 73 years sitting in a signal box in Montana. The lithium battery in the phone you are holding right now will be dead in 3 years. The lead-acid battery in your truck will need replacing in 5. The Edison cell from 1946 is still working in someone's off-grid cabin. Edison filed the definitive patent for the nickel-iron cell in 1909, patent number 967,403. You can look it up yourself in the records of the United States Patent Office, which are publicly available online. Because everything I tell you on this channel, I want you to be able to verify with your own hands. The patent describes the chemistry clearly enough that a person with basic materials knowledge can understand it. The Scientific American ran a full-page feature on January 14, 1911, calling it the storage battery of the future. And then something happened. Henry Ford happened. Ford and Edison were close. Genuinely close, not just professionally. Their summer homes in Fort Myers, Florida sat next door to each other, and you can still visit them both today as a historic site. Ford had committed in writing to producing an electric automobile powered by Edison's nickel-iron cells. The car had a name. They called it the Edison Ford. Prototypes were built. Photographs exist. I have seen one of those photographs in the collections of the Henry Ford Museum in Dearborn, and the expression on Edison's face in it is the expression of a man who believes he is about to change the world. Then the Model T happened. Ford had perfected the gasoline assembly line, and Standard Oil was practically giving gasoline away to create demand for the infrastructure they were building. The math turned brutal overnight. A Model T cost $260 in 1916. An electric car with an Edison battery cost close to $1,000. Not because the battery was expensive to make, but because the production lines for it did not exist at scale, and Standard Oil had no interest in funding the infrastructure that would have made them exist. Ford walked away from the Edison Ford. He never fully explained why in any document I have been able to locate. Edison was reportedly devastated. He kept making the batteries anyway, selling them to railroads, to mining companies, to the United States Navy, which installed them in submarines because they used explosive hydrogen under combat conditions the way lead-acid cells did. Anywhere reliability over decades mattered more than cold cranking power on a January morning in Detroit, the Edison cell was the answer. But the automobile industry had chosen lead-acid, and the automobile industry by 1915 was already the single largest consumer of batteries in North America. That single commercial decision made in those boardrooms between 1912 and 1920 sealed what would happen next. Not immediately. The Edison Storage Battery Company in West Orange kept producing until 1975. 66 years of continuous production after the automobile industry had made its choice. But without the mass market, the technology never scaled, never got cheap enough to compete, never found its way into the hardware stores and the farm supply catalogs where ordinary families might have stumbled across it. By the late 1970s, production in the United States had ceased entirely. The only places still making nickel-iron cells were small operations in Eastern Europe and China and one outfit in the Czech Republic that supplied them mostly to railway museums. The economics of the thing had finally done what the boardroom decisions in 1915 had not quite managed to do completely. A battery that lasts 100 years generates exactly one sale per customer per century. A lead-acid battery generates a sale every 3 to 5 years. A lithium battery generates a sale every 8 years and requires you to throw out the entire device it lives in when it dies. The numbers are the numbers, and the numbers do not work in favor of something that refuses to wear out. Here is where the Amish come in, and this is the part that I could not find in any book, any archive, any academic paper. I found it by driving to Holmes County and sitting in workshops and asking questions of men who had no reason to tell me anything except that they are, in my experience, the most forthcoming people on earth when they understand that you are genuinely trying to learn. The Amish never got the memo that the Edison battery had been retired. Or more precisely, some of them got the memo and evaluated it the way they evaluate everything from the outside world, against their own observation and their own needs, and found it unconvincing. Beginning in the 1940s, Amish communities in Holmes County and Lancaster County began quietly acquiring surplus Edison cells from railroad scrapyards and telegraph company auctions. The railroads were upgrading their signaling systems and selling off the old equipment, and the Amish, who had relationships with the English world that ran specifically along the channels of practical equipment and farm supply, knew about those auctions and attended them. They bought the cells for cents on the dollar. They wired them to small windmills and to dynamos on their treadle-powered machine shops. They charged them during the day and ran their basement lights and workshop lanterns at night. A man named Eli, a cabinet maker outside Berlin, Ohio, showed me a bank of 12 of these cells in his workshop on a morning in March 2 years ago. The shelf they sat on was the same shelf his grandfather had built for them in 1952, when he brought them home from a railroad auction in Pittsburgh for 40 cents each. 40 cents. Eli has never replaced one. He has added distilled water to the electrolyte every 2 years, which takes him about 20 minutes and costs him $3 for the jug of distilled water. The cells have powered the workshop lights, a small fan in the drying room, and a radio that the family says they do not own every single day for 73 years. I sat with those cells for a long time. I asked Eli if he had ever had one fail. He thought about it. He said one of them had gotten water in it that was not distilled, hard water from the tap, and the mineral deposits had caused a problem, and his grandfather had flushed it and refilled it with proper distilled water, and it had been fine ever since. That was the worst thing that had happened to any of them in 73 years. Hard water, fixed in an afternoon. Now I want to tell you how to build one. Not theoretically, specifically, because that is why you are still watching, and that is what I promised you from the beginning. The chemistry is straightforward. You need 2 plates, one of iron and one of nickel oxide. You need a housing to hold them in electrolyte solution. You need potassium hydroxide, which is food-grade lye available from any soap-making supply website, and you need distilled water. That is the complete list of materials. The iron plate. You want low-carbon steel sheet 28 gauge, which runs about $1.50 per square foot from any metal supply house. You cut it to your desired plate size. A plate of roughly 4 inches by 6 inches is a good starting point for a basic cell. You roughen the surface with coarse sandpaper to increase the active surface area, which improves both charge capacity and discharge rate. The iron plate is your negative electrode, the nickel oxide plate. This is the slightly more involved piece. You start with nickel sheet of the same gauge, which costs about $3 per square foot. You oxidize the surface by heating it with a propane torch until it develops a dark oxide coating, then allow it to cool completely. This oxidized surface is your positive electrode. The process takes about 15 minutes and requires nothing beyond a torch and a pair of heavy gloves. The housing, a wide-mouth glass jar with a rubber stopper, works perfectly for a single cell. Quart mason jars are ideal, free if you already have them, 13 cents if you need to buy them. You drill 2 small holes in the stopper for the electrode leads, which are just pieces of copper wire soldered to the top edge of each plate. The stopper seals the jar while allowing the leads to exit, the electrolyte. You mix potassium hydroxide flakes with distilled water to a concentration of roughly 25 to 30% by weight. meaning about 1 part potassium hydroxide to 3 parts water by weight. This produces a strongly alkaline solution. You handle it with gloves and eye protection because it will burn skin and eyes on contact, the same caution you would use with any drain cleaner, which is essentially the same chemistry. You fill the jar to within an inch of the top, drop your plates in with the electrodes through the stopper holes, and seal it. You now have a nickel-iron cell. Total materials cost for a single cell built this way, iron plate, nickel plate, jar, lye, distilled water, comes to somewhere between $4 and $7 depending on where you source the metal. Call it $5. That is where the number in the title of this video comes from. Not an approximation, not a marketing figure, the actual cost of the actual materials. To charge it, you connect a DC power source, a small solar panel works perfectly, to the electrode leads through a basic charge controller to prevent overcharging. A 20-watt solar panel from any hardware store costs around $30 and will charge 2 or 3 cells simultaneously. To discharge it, meaning to use it, you connect whatever load you want to power, an LED light, a phone charger, a small fan, directly to the electrode, leads through an appropriately rated fuse. For practical use, you wire multiple cells in series to reach the voltage you need. 6 cells in series gives you roughly 12 volts. 12 cells gives you 24 volts. You add an inverter on the output side if you need AC power for standard household devices. The whole system can sit in a corner of your basement, in a shed, in a garage, anywhere with basic ventilation because the cells produce a small amount of hydrogen during charging that disperses instantly in open air, but should not be allowed to accumulate in a sealed space. What can you run on this? Eli's 12-cell bank in his workshop, running at roughly 24 volts, handles his workshop lighting, the drying room fan, and the radio. A homeowner with a bank of 8 cells and a 100-watt solar panel can run LED lighting for an entire house, a phone charging station, a modem and router, and a chest freezer in rotation. Not all at once. In the managed way that anyone who has thought seriously about power independence already understands. The way your great-grandparents managed power before the Rural Electrification Act of 1936 made it seem like connecting to the central grid was the only rational option. Now, I want to give you something that I did not find in any patent filing, any chemistry journal, or any university archive. I found it in a notebook, a composition notebook with a cloth cover, gone soft with handling, sitting on a wooden shelf in the back room of a harness shop in Strasburg, Pennsylvania, kept by a man named Jacob Stoltzfus, whose grandfather started writing in it in 1947 and whose father continued it, and who now continues it himself, recording in careful pencil the practical knowledge of 3 generations of Amish men who have been working with Edison cells since before most people alive today were born. Page 11 of that notebook describes a problem that anyone who works with nickel-iron cells eventually encounters. Over decades of charging and discharging, the iron plate slowly develops a thin layer of insoluble iron compounds on its surface. The cell still works, but it loses somewhere around 10% of its capacity every 20 years. Not catastrophic, not a failure, just a slow dimming that most people accept as the inevitable cost of even a very long-lived battery. The Amish in Jacob's community did not accept it. They worked on it. And what they found is written on page 11 in handwriting that shifts between 2 different people, the grandfathers and the fathers, as though the discovery unfolded across a conversation that happened over years rather than days. One specific addition to the electrolyte, lithium hydroxide, not lithium-ion chemistry. Just a small amount of lithium hydroxide powder added to the potassium hydroxide solution. Roughly 50 grams per liter of electrolyte. The lithium does not store energy. It does not change the voltage. What it does is prevent the iron plate from forming the insulating layer that slowly chokes the cell over decades. It keeps the surface of the plate chemically active through the same mechanism that lithium additives in industrial alkaline solutions have been used for since the mid-20th century, in applications that never made it into the popular understanding of battery chemistry. With this addition, the capacity loss over 20 years drops from roughly 10% to something so close to 0 that the men in Jacob's community cannot reliably measure it. Jacob told me the cell his grandfather marked with a notch on the steel can in the spring of 1950, the first one he treated with the lithium hydroxide additive, the one his grandfather called his experiment, was still in service in the workshop when Jacob showed me the notebook in 2023. 73 years on the same plates, the same electrolyte, no detectable loss of capacity. The notch is still visible. Lithium hydroxide is available from any pottery or ceramic supply company. It is used in glaze chemistry and costs around $40 a pound. 1 pound treats 50 cells. You add it once when you first fill the cell and never add it again. That is the entire secret. 1 pound of lithium hydroxide, split 50 ways, adds $1.50 to the cost of each $5 cell. And what you get in return is a battery that, as far as anyone who has actually watched one age can tell, simply does not wear out. Not in our lifetime. Not in our grandchildren's lifetime. Edison knew about lithium salts. He mentioned them in passing in a lab notebook from 1907. He was in the middle of fighting for market share and getting the basic chemistry into production, and he did not pursue it. The refinement that would have made his already extraordinary battery truly indefinite was sitting in his own notes, undeveloped, while the industry that would bury his work was already making its choices in the next room. An Amish blacksmith in Strasburg, Pennsylvania, figured it out 42 years later because he was too stubborn to accept that a good battery had to get worse over time. And he wrote it down in a notebook that his son kept and his grandson keeps, and now you know it too. I think about my grandfather's shoebox of electric bills sometimes. $47,000 across 51 years paid to a company he never met for a service he never questioned because he did not know there was anything to question. Nobody told him. Not because the alternative did not exist. It existed in 1951. The Edison Storage Battery Company was still running production in West Orange, New Jersey in 1951. The cells were available. The knowledge was available. The Amish in Lancaster County were using them. But nobody who had access to that knowledge had any reason to tell my grandfather about it. The utility company did not tell him because telling him would have ended his bill. The battery manufacturers did not tell him because they were already aligned with the lead-acid chemistry that needed replacing every few years. The government did not tell him because the Rural Electrification Act had been built around grid dependency and the political and industrial infrastructure that came with it. Everyone who might have told him had already decided, each for their own reasons, that his ignorance was more useful than his knowledge. The Amish did not get that memo either. Because the Amish have always been the kind of people who build their own houses and fix their own equipment and make their decisions about what technology serves their community and what technology makes them dependent on people they do not know for things they cannot control. They kept the Edison battery because it worked, because it was theirs, because a battery you build from sheet metal and a pickle jar and 3 chemicals from a supply catalog is a battery that belongs to you in a way that nothing you lease from a utility company on a 51-year payment plan ever will. Start small. Buy 1 cell worth of materials, $5. Build it on a weekend afternoon. Wire it to a small solar panel. Watch it charge and discharge. Watch it work. And then sit with the feeling of that for a while. Because what you are feeling, that quiet particular satisfaction of a thing you built with your own hands producing power that belongs entirely to you, is something an awful lot of Americans have not felt in a very long time. Your grandfather's generation lost it. Maybe 1 generation before that. It was not taken in a single moment. It left the way most important things leave. Gradually, quietly, payment by payment, bill by bill, envelope by envelope in a shoebox in a closet. You can start getting it back this weekend for $5. With sheet metal and a pickle jar, and the knowledge that a man named Thomas Edison put into a patent in 1901, and that an Amish blacksmith in Strasburg, Pennsylvania, improved in 1949, and that nobody with anything to sell you ever had any reason to pass along. Now you have it. Do something with it. In the comments below, tell me this. What is the one piece of equipment in your family that has outlasted everything around it? The tool or the machine or the object that has been handed down because it simply refused to stop working? Leave it in the comments. I read every single one, and those stories are some of the best material that comes through this channel because they are proof in your own family that things built to last do last, and that the decision to build things that do not last was a choice somebody made, not an inevitability. Subscribe if you are not already here. Next week, I am going back to Holmes County to show you the Amish root cellar system, a method for maintaining a constant 52-degree storage temperature year-round without electricity and without insulation foam, built from a clay pipe, a bucket of sand, and a technique written about in a USDA bulletin from 1922 that was never mentioned in any government publication again. It costs under $60 to build. It has been keeping Amish families fed through Ohio winters since before anyone alive today was born. Stay with me. We are taking it back one piece at a time.